Hi, everybody, and thanks so much for joining me this afternoon. It is afternoon here in sunny South Florida, but it's probably still morning for a lot of you out there. I'm here today with my really good friend, Robert Kiesecker. And hey, Robert, I'm so glad that you can join me today.
Yeah, I'm honored. Thank you.
And today is National Creme Brulee Day. I noticed that Lexi made creme brulee coffee this morning. I don't know if that was planned or if it just kind of happened, but also National Chili Dog Day. So if that turns you on more than the creme brulee, then
I
hey.
Chili dog does a little bit more for me than the creme brulee. I had a bowl of cereal, so no fancy coffee for me today.
Absolutely. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about chapters 16 and 17 of the guidelines. And I know that you're a dad, so you've had experience with those perinatal little babies from the time that they get here and they're delivering. They're so cute and squishy until 28 days, and then they start really, demanding our attention a little bit more. So that's always the fun time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always interesting. Teaching and being an instructor, it's always kind of it's an interesting conversation to have. Trying to talk about pregnancy and babies when you hadn't necessarily gone through it. I am blessed to have two beautiful boys. Thank you. And it was interesting. It was really interesting just to kind of see the process, because from a guy's standpoint, sometimes it's hard to understand, what's happening. And going through that process and seeing everything, those amazing nurses and the doctors and doing what they're doing in the hospital. And my first kiddo, Mr. Dominic, we had a very interesting um, introduction to the world. We got to meet the ICU nurses, the NICU nurses.
Oh,
So some of my neighbors, I got to see some of these diagnoses in action, and it was really hard. And it's one of those things where when you become a parent, everything is like magnified. So
yeah.
even as we go through some of these diagnoses, I think everybody's journey is different, and I'm not being judgmental on anybody. Things happen, and but I think the thing that was interesting to me was some of these diagnoses and even life choices, wherever you want to, don't mean to get too deep, but these
Hmm.
things stay with these patients for their entire life. um, it's not just something that they have during those first couple weeks of birth,
We
of
had an
coming into the world.
experience.
Yeah, so
My
yeah.
husband, everybody knows all my husband's ailments at this point. There's just like no secrets out there. He was actually born with the sphincter that goes from the stomach to the duodenum was fused. So
Oh
here's this
wow.
tiny baby who's trying to eat and everything is coming back up and he's just miserable because he just got here. He thought he was going to get a hot meal. Nothing's going down. The belly is rumbling. And at 3 days old, he had to have a surgery. And he still has this itty bitty baby scar, like on this giant man. But throughout his life, he has suffered from such GI problems, and
Wow.
that history of having that, and while they did repair it, and he went on to be a very good eater. um, he had that over and over again. We had to discuss that's he's had these GI problems since the very beginning, and we watch how um, maybe that has affected his overall GI problems. So yeah, you never know.
Yeah. No, Mr. Dominic had, I'm trying to remember exactly what he had, but it was, it's funny looking at it now, but we went through all the classes. We were the I perfect little parents. We did all the little classes at the hospital. We did everything we were doing. We read several books and webcam or podcasts and the whole 9 yards. And we had our
So you
little
were ready.
folder with our plan in it,
Uh-huh.
of what we were going to do. And that plan went out the window as soon as that young man came out. And he had double pneumothorax. So he blew out the bottom of both of his lungs.
No way.
Yeah, so he came out, and mom had some complications as well, but that's a whole separate conversation. We'll talk about that when you want to talk about OB and complications of pregnancy. But when he came out, it was interesting because you've got the whole delivery team,
Right.
but you have this other NICU team that comes in and assesses, and they're going to be there no matter what. But they will assess the child, and they'll be able to kind of determine if there's any ailments that they can kind of identify as soon as they're born. Well, he had this really, he sounded like a sea lion. I don't know how else to say it. But he was just like this barking, and
What?
we didn't know any better. We didn't know, whether that was good or bad. And I was focused on my wife and what was going on with her. And this nurse, I remember this little, she was a shorter nurse. She came over to the bedside and she's like, "We're taking your baby. We're
Oh,
taking you up to the NICU." I'm like, "Okay." So
oh my
I went
God.
with the baby, and mom stayed down there, and they had all kinds of tubes and wires and all kinds of stuff, and it was interesting because um, you kind of get to see in the NICU, you kind of get to see a lot of this stuff, and like our neighbors were, every baby had a different story about what was going on, and he ended up being okay.
Yeah.
He bounced back within a couple days. He got to hang out in the hospital for a week or two, but he healed right up, and tubes came out, and he started eating,
Wow.
and he's like you said, normal little baby. Wouldn't even have any idea that there was ever any kind of anything going on. So
Oh my God. Except that the parents, we're the parents, we get to hold those scars of what
yeah,
happened.
yeah,
And that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that with us because
yeah.
I've never experienced that, but I can imagine from that perspective. I just had a friend who delivered at 27 weeks.
Oh
Um,
wow.
but this little girl, let me tell you, she was a fighter. Within 3 days, she was eating her by herself. Within 3 weeks, she was home. She was like,
Yeah.
"I'm just not playing this game. I'm a strong, independent woman, and we're going to make this happen." So, uh, but I could see that neonatal team would be the ones who would utilize this section of the guidelines the most, considering
Yeah.
that chapter 16 is only for those little newborn babies through 28 days. And I like the way that it says it's never used on the maternal record. And I don't know if you remember, there was a TV show called The Dinosaurs, where they had these live characters that were in costume, and there was a little tiny baby, and he was constantly going, "Not
I'm
the
the
mama."
baby. Yeah.
Right? You remember that? Yes. So these are the not the mama codes. That's kind of how I got it written in my book. Not the mama. Um, but like you said, these codes can be used throughout someone's life, depending on if these conditions that they have kind of roll over to, beyond 28 days there.
Yeah. And no, and I couldn't agree more. And I think that that's kind of the thing that I don't know. It's always been kind of challenging to me is that you start off with one patient, and then all of a sudden you have this diversion, and now you have two patients,
Right.
and you have to code them out kind of separately. And I think those, to your point, those NICU nurses and those even those what do they call them, couplet care nurses, and that whole team, they're going to be the ones that are going to kind of initially identify these.
Hmm.
Um, but even as kind of like I was kind of refreshing on some of the guidelines coming into this, I saw a lot of guidelines that were talking about code underlying conditions first. Um, So I think there's a lot of causal effects that kind of happen in this chapter as well. Okay, you have this symptom or this disease process, and it's causing this other, challenge that's occurring. So
Yeah, like in my
yeah,
husband's
good point.
case, he lost weight in those first 3 to 5 days, well, the first 5 days that he was alive. I mean, he lost a significant amount of weight because he couldn't eat. And they had to code that, and they had to code, a little bit of concern that he wasn't getting the nourishments just after getting here, and that was a big concern. There's one section that's in the guideline that I think is kind of really interesting. It is I-16A6. And, I always kind of think about what is clinically significant. What does that mean? Not just in this chapter, but even as we think about other chapters and other diagnosis codes, and and I think about clinically significant, and I'm always asked, from a medical necessity perspective, and then we say it's got to be clinically significant. What does that mean? Well, they give us some guidance here, and they tell us it's got to be a clinical evaluation, a therapeutic treatment, a diagnostic process, extends a length of stay. Like it says, these are the things that support it, any diagnosis being clinically significant with the patients there. So I thought that was kind of awesome, and it was kind of hidden in this chapter.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And, I have found that those types of things are awesome opportunities to get to know your providers if you have that ability. Those are the things that, having a conversation with your provider sometimes can be a little awkward, and you kind of feel like, who are you to be able to say whether I should or shouldn't do that. But I think that is one of those things where, hey, doctor, I have this code.
Yeah,
What do you think? What makes it clinically significant to you? And most providers, they're going to love to talk to you
yeah,
about, all of that stuff. And then you can kind of take that conversation and then put it in the framework of that code and be like, okay, this is the real world. This is how they're interpreting it. This, and then within the description of the chapter of that code, this is where that would kind of fall. And I think that gives you a really good um, understanding
yeah.
of those codes, because the thing that I guess I've learned this recently after doing this for a little bit. The codes are not meant to be adversarial to the providers. They're meant to support what they're trying to do.
Right.
They're meant to, be
Our
taken
friend,
in. Yeah.
our friend Betty Hovey taught me a little trick that I use with providers now, and she said, "Walk me through it."
Yes.
And that is almost when I saw this section again in the guidelines, that's exactly what I thought. I had Betty in my head going, "Walk me through it," and I was like, "Yes, yes,
Yeah.
that's what it is."
Yeah. I've heard a few people use the term, and I don't know who originally, holds the original saying, but I've heard a lot of people use it. But it's thinking ink.
Betty says it a lot.
And yeah.
If you think it,
So
ink it, is what Betty
yeah,
says, I think.
yeah. Because a lot of providers, I mean, they got so much stuff going on. They're like, "Well, I did that. You didn't tell me.
I
You gotta
know.
tell me." So
I know. That's so
yeah, good
difficult.
point. Yeah.
Well, to kind of go through a little bit more of the guidelines, um, we have a specific code that well, first of all, it gives us the very first code that a newborn receives, so the minute they get here and they get their very first code and they're introduced to that Z38, welcome to the world code. I think that's what it should be renamed. Welcome to the world. But if that baby has to stay in the hospital because maybe they want to see something, or like with your son, they want to see if there's any problems there, and then wonderfully it gets ruled out, there's nothing wrong, there's a code for that, and they tell us that, unless of course there's signs and symptoms, and we always code signs and symptoms without a definitive diagnosis. But I thought that was interesting that sometimes we watch those little babies as soon as they get here to see if there's anything that we are suspecting might be there, but then it turns out to not be. Yay!
Yeah.
You did a great job, little guy. So maybe the welcome to the world code and then the you did a good job code, the Z05.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think, so many times these little, guys and gals, they rebound so quickly to begin with. So you see a signs and symptoms, you see something that's going on, and you start to evaluate it, and many times by the time that you've come up with a definitive, diagnosis and an ultimate prognosis, they're starting to resolve. So this stuff happens really fast. Stuff, a lot of these codes, a lot of these processes are, you're gonna identify them, you're gonna start to treat them, and then they, in a lot of ways they start to resolve.
Yeah,
I think that when you start to see some of those long-term effects, um, um, when you start to see some of those long-term effects, um, you that's where you start. I think it starts getting a little bit, dare I say, more complicated, because you have
yeah,
to start seeing, okay, what is the relationship of how this is going to affect, certain
yeah,
things. And to your husband's point, not all of these things can be treated right off the bat. Like some of this
yeah,
stuff, like we're gonna have to push this out a little bit, especially with some of like the cardiac surgery type of stuff. Some of those anomalies,
yeah,
um, you're gonna have to have So when I use the word prognosis,
yeah.
we're talking about a plan. Okay, we have this disease. What's the plan that we're gonna do to treat it? Um,
And
and
do we
that
need
may
to
be,
do it right now? Can it
yeah,
wait until the baby gets a little bit bigger, stronger, can support that a little bit more? I think we see that a lot. We see that in a lot of preemies that
yeah,
happen. And preemie is anybody that is technically anybody that's born before 37 weeks.
yeah.
But like my grandson, the love of my life. Okay, let it be a said, and it's officially now forever. He is. Um, he was born at 35 weeks, but there was nothing wrong with him. He was
Yep.
just ready. So
Yep.
at 35 weeks, he came. He went home 2 days later because he was eating and drinking and peeing and pooping and all the great things that those little, um, little guys do. And there was nothing wrong with him. So sometimes, there's even a great guideline there that tells us that just because you got here early doesn't mean that you get a diagnosis, that you have any type of slow growth or slow, any of those relationships that we might assume. It has to be documented in the medical record that that they found something or that they have this condition or this concern. And without having it documented, then we can't assume that there's something else wrong with this baby. Because again, like I said, my grandson, 35 weeks, he came out, he was like, give me the keys, I'm going home, you know?
I could not agree with you more. I have a really good friend that she's actually a type 1 diabetic. She's been diabetic her whole life. She's obviously on insulin, healthy, she's got healthy weight, has a healthy lifestyle, other than the diabetes, she's very well controlled, the whole 9 yards. Her husband, very healthy individual, and their baby was born, I want to say it was one day before 35 days. So it was technically 34 weeks. And he was a strapping 11 pounds and
Whoa.
so many ounces, fully developed, full head of hair. Um,
Whoa.
good
Can
little,
you imagine another month in there? Like he would
right?
have just taken over the body. She would have just like started a beard and it would have just been the new person. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. So I think that, they named his first name was Ford. So I feel like, when you start naming a male with, a strong name like that, you're asking for an 11-pound baby at 34 weeks. But yeah,
Wow.
to your point, he was healthy.
Yeah,
At 34 weeks, he was fully developed and ready to take the keys to the truck, literally. And no complications. Everything was good. So,
that's awesome.
these babies sometimes they're their own little person. They're going to do what they need to do, and sometimes they need to cook longer and sometimes they need to cook less, I guess. But
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. I think, there's sometimes things are a science and sometimes things are an art. And I think when it comes to delivery, that's more of an art. It's up to the baby of what time they're going to come. Not that there aren't external causes sometimes that will make that happen, but when we hear stories of those babies that get here early and big, or early and even at low birth weight, but there's no other conditions, no other signs, no other symptoms. My friend who had her baby at 27 weeks, that baby was 2 pounds and change, but she brought home, I think that the baby had to be 4 pounds before she could bring it home. But that baby ate food and took food from the very beginning and gained that weight in a very short period of time. And kind of like me around my birthday month. And, you know, went home early and that wasn't a problem for it. There was no affecting that baby's health status. And so it's really
yeah,
important that we remember that. And by the way, there's a guideline for that, right? Low birth weight. And does it affect the baby's health status or not? Or they just petite and then they're not, or whatever that happens to be.
yeah. And the other thing, and you said it, and I know we're talking about the guidelines for ICD-10, but I would also take into consideration that when we're talking about babies of low birth weight or preemies or any, all of that, you're going to see effects on your anesthesia codes. You're going to
Mhm.
see effect on a lot of your surgery codes. A lot of your surgery codes are going to have specifics for either age of the patient. Some of them even may be based on weight.
Right. The modifier
So
for the weight.
yeah,
Yeah.
so, these are things that, if you're in this realm or you're thinking about getting into this realm, you know, there's a lot of special considerations taken for the babies. And, especially if there's those other, I don't know, comorbidities, I guess. I guess you would call it a low birth
Yeah,
weight comorbidity.
absolutely. And they talk about bacterial sepsis,
Yeah.
COVID-19. There were babies born during COVID-19 and mom
Yeah.
was COVID-19 positive,
Yes.
or babies that right after delivery tested positive for COVID-19. And as coders, I was really, really relieved that we had some guidelines to even tell us how to navigate that, because listen, COVID hit us all kind of blindsided us. We didn't see it coming. And then we all had to become COVID experts overnight.
Yeah.
And that was a little challenging. So as they added more and more guidance in the guidelines, whether it be for mom or whether it be for the baby, I was super, super thrilled to see that, since it took up so much. It was 3 years of our life that were kind of um, revolving around COVID.
Yeah, no, and it's I'm kind of excited to. I mean, I use the word excited, but I'm happy to be out of COVID, but I'm also just fascinated to see what those long term effects are going to start to be. I know with the hospital that I was working at, we first started having those types of babies. It was really scary because we weren't sure how that was going to affect the baby. There wasn't, I mean, but in some situations, and I don't know if I'm sure there's some research study going on this somewhere, but what they're finding is that in some situations, those babies were actually being born with some antibodies
Yeah.
associated with COVID-19 that, and that was the other thing. And again, this is a separate conversation, but when we were on our second baby, it was in the middle of COVID. And the big debate was about the vaccine, whether or not,
Oh,
because early
yeah.
on in the conversation, they were worried that should moms receive the vaccine going into, pregnancy? And we asked our doctor, and I mean, I even went and asked the medical director at our hospital, and they're like, guys, you got to
We
make
don't
the best call. Yeah. And it's come out that it was fine, and everything worked out okay for us. But looking at those long term effects, you're going to see those things start to come
Yeah.
up of long term effects. Does
Well,
COVID
they had
have?
a new diagnosis code that was that post-COVID or long haul
Yeah, long
COVID.
COVID. Yeah,
Right. And
yeah,
so we already know that we are going to see some, and I'm just like you, Robert. I'm so excited to see some of the research that'll tell us, the efficacy of the vaccines, the antibodies that were created, and how are those going to protect us from future COVID related conditions, and
yeah,
that prevention, that we never have to experience this again, at least in our lifetime. um, my grandparents had to deal with, or my great grandparents had to deal with, you know the um, the plague that happened back in the day, and so they were dealing with that, and now with this generation we've had to deal with that. Hopefully we get to go another couple of 3 generations before something else pops up, and hopefully we've done enough research to leave that information behind so that they can piggyback where we left off, and see that it doesn't get as out of control as it did this time. Yeah.
yeah. It was definitely, hindsight. You look back at it, there was a lot that was learned. There was a lot to learn, professionally and personally, and the whole 9 yards. I think that we're going to spend a lot of time over the next couple of years really looking at what the long term effects are going to be, and what the future is going to hold with that,
Well, that
related
kind
to
of
that.
takes us into chapter 17. Do
Yeah,
we think that we're going to see any congenital malformations, deformations, chromosomal abnormalities? We don't know. We don't know if that's
we
going to
don't,
happen, right?
we don't know.
Uh, and in that case, you know, are they going to give us new codes to report these abnormalities that we might be seeing? I don't know. And
Yeah,
and the guidelines tell us that some of these abnormalities might be things that have to be coded for the rest of our lives. I know that I've shared with all of my friends, I have a congenital connective tissue disorder. And so a lot of the things that I'm dealing with now that I'm later in life, and unfortunately, in case you don't know this, but as you get older, Robert, everything starts to break down a little bit and it's just awful. Don't do it if you can avoid getting older. Even Rachel, please don't get older. It's not all it's cracked up to be. It's not all glamorous. But that these conditions, now I'm seeing that my Q codes are getting reported more and more to kind of explain why I have these new conditions related to the congenital conditions, or the abnormality that I have there. Very, very interesting. And those codes continue on. So there's not a whole lot in the guidelines for this chapter, but that was one of the things that stood out to me, was that we continue to code these throughout someone's life as long as they're relevant.
yeah. No, I agree, and I don't know if I actually ever shared this with you, but I also have a neurological connective tissue type thing. It's called a Charcot-Tooth-Marie disorder. I guess it's kind of a form of muscular dystrophy, but essentially the nerves in my arms and my legs are like kind of firing all the time. So it
Oh,
does two things. So it creates, and I would show you my feet, but they're pretty gnarly. But they cause you very high arches, hammer
uh-huh.
toed, and it's hard to get muscle mass. So I've had to kind of go through that through my whole life, and I'm starting to get the first couple tastes of becoming a little bit older, and really, because when I was younger, it wasn't as big of a deal.
Right,
It
right.
was kind of like, oh, don't leave me with that. But now, as I'm getting older, the effects of that are really starting to kick in. I was literally, I was getting out of the shower yesterday, and I went to lift my leg, and my leg didn't lift. Like, it just kind of drug on the ground,
Oh
and
no.
I jammed 3 of my toes into the tile. So my toes, I have 3 toes that are literally like the color of my shirt right now.
Oh
It's pretty
no.
bad. Yeah, so it was to that point. I mean, it's kind of joking, but these ailments have an effect. It's not just the physical effects of that ailment, and I don't think that I can't say that there's a causal relationship between that and jamming your toe, but
Well, we might as well give it to it because,
exactly,
whatever we can blame works.
exactly.
I'm that way. When something is misfiring on myself, when something's not working, I just, oh, well, it's that problem. It's from that. And
Exactly.
it's funny how we become so almost numb to it. Like I'll just say, oh, that's just part of my connective tissue disorder. Oh, well, that happened. Let's just fix that real quick. I get a
Yeah.
lot of dislocations. So, oh, it dislocated again. We just got to pop it back in.
Yeah. No, mine is I have a pretty high tolerance for pain just because like I'm just used to it always hurting. They're like, "Doesn't that hurt?" I'm like, "Well, not any more than it normally does." Like,
Right. Right.
so but and my wife tells me that I have princess feet because with the
Oh,
high arches, it's hard to walk
right.
around barefoot. Like I always have to wear like slippers or something because it hurts to walk on tile. So
That's
yeah,
why
it's
you love Birkenstocks.
what?
Do
Yeah,
you wear Birkenstock shoes? I
I
love
don't.
Birkenstock.
I recently bought my first set of Crocs. So I've entered that realm. So
Well, I'll tell you, if you decide to go Birkenstock, all of us that have problems with our feet, we swear by it. I know that Beth Schleeper and Gary, they both wear Birkenstocks, and they're very proud wearers of Birkenstocks, and so am I. So think about that. Robert, our time is over today. Can you believe it went by so quickly? I think I
it
say
did. It
this.
went by really fast.
Pardon? So, just to let you guys know, Robert and I actually met at Mastering the Business of Medicine in San Diego this year. It was an amazing, amazing experience. I know that you all have heard myself and Sonal and Betty Hovey and Beth Schleeper. We've all been promoting the next event in New York. We're going to have the next Mastering the Business of Medicine retreat. And I have talked about this on the podcast before, but wanted just to remind you all that it is an amazing experience, nothing that you have ever experienced before. The intimacy with the experts, the knowledge, the fellowship, the friendships that are developed during the retreat are not like anything you're ever going to experience anywhere else. And so if you have a couple of days in the end of September and you would like to come and help me celebrate my birthday, I would look forward to seeing you all in New York City. Not in the city, actually. We're outside. We're in the Hudson Valley of New York, and we'll be talking about the 2024 proposal, and we'll be talking about Target Probe and Educate, and we'll be talking about NCCI and ICD-10 guideline updates. You're not going to want to miss Ruby Woodward to talk to you about those updates there. And Pam Vanderbilt will be there. Beth Schleeper will be there. Robert, I don't know if you and Rachel are going to be there or you're
I'm
catching the next
not. I won't be able to be at that one, but I was going to say if the East Coast is a little bit far, I will be on the West Coast later next year in San Diego, and then earlier, right after New York, I'll be in beautiful Prescott Valley in Arizona. So I'll be at those 2 events. I won't be able to make the New York one, but I would highly recommend you guys check it out. I've had be at a lot of different conferences, and this is unlike, and we don't even we call it a retreat. It's not like anything I've been at where
experience.
you get to talk and interact with people and get to know people. I met Christine at there. I met Lexi there. It was a wonderful opportunity. I'm like, hey, we have so much in common. Like, it was very, very, very,
It
a
was
wonderful
amazing.
event. So
Thanks again, Robert, for being on.
thanks, guys.
Robert's contact information. is scrolling across the bottom. Please make sure you connect with him on LinkedIn. Just an amazing wealth of knowledge, my friends. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Thanks for watching.